Mohammed.
What's in it? Markus, welcome to Somali Studies.
Thank you very much, Mohammed.
First of all, just for the benefit of our audience, can you just quickly introduce yourself and your background, please?
Yeah, so I'm Markus Hoehne. I'm a German student of social anthropology, and I have been working on Somali affairs since, I would say, 2001, when I did my MA thesis. I started writing my MA thesis in 2001 on strategies of peaceful conflict settlement at the local and international level. And I took as an example Somalia as a whole. But that study was based on literature only, so I never had gone anywhere to Africa before that time. And so when I did my MA on that, and I read a lot of historical, anthropological and political works on Somalia, I realized that it's a very interesting place, and it's quite diverse also, politically speaking. I got news. It was the first time I learned about that things are different in southern Somalia and in northern Somalia. I learned about Somaliland and I learned about Puntland. It was the time of the Arta peace conference, like Arta was just closed and there was this new government in place. So so it was all quite interesting, and then I thought after I finished my MA that I should actually look at the situation with my own eyes. And in Germany I met a Somali from the north, from Somaliland, and he invited me and said, why don't you come to Hargeisa, so you can stay in my house, and you can look at things yourself. So I did that in 2002, in summer 2002. That was the first time I went anywhere to Africa. So Somaliland was my first destination, but it was also my first time in Africa.
Okay. So why did you exactly choose that area and not South Somalia, for example?
Yeah, that was a pragmatic reason that it was the most peaceful area in the Somali territories. So Somaliland was most peaceful. I was also quite interested in these state formation dynamics. You know, like you had Somaliland on the one hand, then I had learned about Puntland when I was in the region. I had learned that there was a conflict in Sool and Sanaag region over, is it actually Somaliland, is it Puntland, is it Somalia? And I thought that would be really an interesting topic, like a micro study of state formation and identity formation. And Somalia, the rest of Somalia, or southern Somalia, was not quite there. I mean, that was a time when you had the Arta government, you had the warlords, you had this coalition of warlords against Arta, if you remember, led by Abdullahi Yusuf and Hussein Aidid and Omar Chess, and these people who were actually supported by Ethiopia against Abdikasim Salat Hassan. And so it was, the political situation in southern Somalia was not benefiting for me. I mean, it was not peaceful, and it was an ongoing conflict. Whereas in northern Somalia, I had the feeling, yeah, I could really do some substantial socio-anthropological work on these interesting dynamics.
Okay. I hope it pans out very well for you. As we can see, you've had a lot of material written on that area.
Yeah.
You sit in so many panels as an advisor, and you've written a lot of as an expert researcher in that area, a lot of material on that, which is very beneficial material to read. You've also co-edited several books in accumulation of in terms of that area and the works you've done. Such as cooperating with the late Virginia. Can you just tell us a bit more about that work?
Virginia Luling.
Yeah, sort of to honor her as well and her contribution.
Yeah, no, that is very good. No, I learned Virginia. I think I learned her personally in 2005. We met on a conference in London, and ever since we had been in contact. And she was so kind to introduce me to all kinds of interesting Somalia-related things. And I appreciated her work, since she did really from early on. She always took on issues which have been completely under-researched in Somali studies. I mean, she did her long-term research in Afgoye on people who are not a politically dominant group, like Geledi, Begedi. She knew a lot about Asharaf and other groups which are not, politically dominant in Somalia. Even historically, their history has often been ignored. It was often the history of the strong groups and the culture of the strong groups, which was making the headlines or which made it into the articles and the books. So she took these issues on, and she has, I don't know if you know, she has a very beautiful article in 1984. It's called The Other Somali, which came out in proceedings of a Somali study conference which happened in Hamburg in the 1980s, early 1980s, which is, up to this day actually one of the best articles on Somali minority groups, or so-called minority groups if you like, their history, their culture, their situation. So, and she did that in the 80s. So she was, in my perspective, she was always somebody who took on very interesting issues which have been ignored by others, and she was extremely dedicated. She really loved Somalis. She loved Somalia. She loved Somali culture. And she was an extreme sincere scholar, I would say, who never took things lightly, and she was always questioning herself, and she was really making great effort to produce accurate accounts of Somali culture and history. So I admired that. She was very meticulous in her work. So she was not very prolific, as you know. She didn't publish hundreds of articles and books, but what she has published, it was of high quality, and she had a very deep knowledge. So anyway, I saw her like as a teacher friend, and then at one point I knew that she had been a PhD student of Johan Lewis in the 1960s and 70s in London, and then I also came to know Johan Lewis, and of course he is somebody who has done a very important work in Somali studies. I mean, if you read his early books, like starting with People of the Horn of Africa, which came out 1955, and then of course Pastoral Democracy, which came out 1961. I mean, these are still extremely rich accounts of Somali history, politics, and culture. So I know that in Somali studies he is sometimes criticized for his positions, and I think there are also sometimes good reasons to criticize him. But I think at the same time, one shouldn't, in German we say, you shouldn't throw out the child with the bathwater, right? So there are things which are still very important, which he has done, and still, you can still learn a tremendous amount from his early work. Yeah. And though we said, since she was a student of his and I was kind of an admirer of his, we said, okay, he's becoming 80 very soon. In 2010, it was his 80th birthday. So we sat together and thought we make this kind of Festschrift, which is actually a German tradition, and a tradition in German academia, but obviously it also has found its way into the British academia, because you have the term in English, even Festschrift, which is a German word. So it's basically a book which honors a well-established scholar. And so we got together a lot of people. We sent emails around to like dozens of people, and we got a lot of interesting replies, good replies actually. And so we took this work on together, and this was where we became really close, Virginia and I.
But going further to the core of the interview, could you please briefly recount for us the historical context of the area that you research on, what is known as British Somaliland, i.e. Sool Sanaag, Puntland, Somaliland, that sort of area?
As you know, I mean, the colonial history of northern Somalia, I mean, it began in a way before it became really militarized. It began in the early 19th century with the construction of the Suez Canal, which was, I think, the construction work, or the work began in 1839, and it was concluded in, I think, 30 years later in 1869, and with this project, the whole region of the Horn of Africa became strategically very important, because it opened the route from the Mediterranean Sea through the Gulf of Aden to the Indian Ocean to India, basically. So everybody became really interested. I mean, everybody in Europe, I would say, the French, the Germans, Germans not yet, but the French and the British particularly, they were competing in those days. So with this project of the Suez Channel, the Horn of Africa really became interesting for European imperial powers, and then European colonialism set in the late 19th century, as we all know, with the scramble for Africa. It also had an Ethiopian side, as you know, an Abyssinian side with Menelik II, who very early on established himself as like an African colonialist, I would say. He must have been a very intelligent man. I mean, he sensed that if he doesn't take a very strong position, his empire will also become eventually a colony. So very early on, he set the record straight. Then there was the Battle of Adwa, where Ethiopian forces actually defeated Italian colonial forces. It must have been in 1896. That was the first time ever this happened in Africa, and it really established the Ethiopians as a African colonial power in the region, I would say. And I mean, as you know, the borderlines have been drawn over a longer period of time. I think there have been various agreements, whatever Anglo-French agreement, which established the border between what is Somaliland and Djibouti, Anglo-Ethiopian agreement, which established the border between Somaliland and Abyssinia, must have been around 1894, and then the Anglo-Italian agreement, which established the border between the Italian Somali part, which is today from Puntland to the south, to between Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland, and this was, I think, must have been in 1908 or 1904. I think 1904 probably. This borderline in the east of Somaliland, of the British Protectorate, this is also the one which is still contested up until today in the region of Sool and Sanaag.
And now I want to ask you the context of the unification of British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland. Was there basically some sort of a problematic issues that developed from this unification, or did everything basically happen like, kumbaya, everything was wonderful?
Yeah, of course
that's a narrative that we get a lot. We get it a lot. The Somali unification was so good and everybody has that drums, but is it really?
No, I think it like with history, you always have to be careful how it's getting interpreted at various times. Though what I find fascinating, if you look at the time, like in the 1950s probably, you would see that there was a very strong Somali nationalism in place all over the Horn of Africa, I would say, all over the Somali inhabited Horn of Africa. And you have people like Sultan Timur Ade, who is actually from the north, who I once had the chance to read some of his early poetry. A guy called Bobe Yusuf Bobe, who is based in Hargeisa. He collected the poetry of Sultan Timur Ade, and if you read through the earlier work of this very famous Somali poet, then you see that he was such a strong nationalist, and he expressed, I think, like Somali poets do in general, he expressed the view of the masses, right? So these they have the gift to take up important issues and frame them in a very artistic and beautiful way and entertain people, but also express political views. And I think Sultan Timur Ade was not the only political poet of his time and of this region of Somalia, but he was maybe the most famous one. And if you read his work from the 1950s, you see that there was actually a strong anti-colonialism, anti-British sentiment in the area. There was a very strong nationalism in the area, particularly in the north of Somalia, which then actually swept all across the Somali territories. And I think when the unification happened on 1st of July 1960, it was a big celebration, of course. It was, everybody was really happy, and ideologically or emotionally, people, I would say 99% of all Somalis were deeply satisfied. There have been a couple of cautious voices. You know that there has been this Hizbul, there was a party in southern Somalia which was maybe dominated by Digil and Merifle, which was a bit more careful about the idea of immediate unification. I think they had the proposition that there should be kind of a federation first, and then after some time people should discuss unification. And I think also in Somaliland, in the British Protectorate, there were also some personalities who advocated for a bit more careful approach, but the vast majority of Somalis, the politicians and also the ordinary people, they were just rushing into unification between Somaliland or British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland. And as you always have it, like after the party is over, then the headache comes, I guess, and then people realized already in 1961, that things are actually have not been well prepared. Yeah. So there was a lot of complications when it came to the administration, when it came to the different traditions of administration, the British tradition, the Italian tradition, when it came to education, when it came also to power sharing. So there were, I think also historically speaking, very early on people sensed that something has not been done well. Again, Sultan Timur Ada, I think already in 1961, so just 1 year after unification, created a poem which points at these difficulties. I think I remember there was, I think, the Somali Prime Minister visiting Hargeisa in 61, and Sultan Timur Ada was among the welcoming committee, and he performed a poem in which he already mentioned that things are not going as we were hoping in Somalia, and that the political class basically should rethink its strategy. So I think you could see early on there was already these problems, but nevertheless, I think the majority of Somalis remained just Somali Wane or nationalists, and they even tolerated these complications. There has been a small revolution or an attempted coup in northern Somalia, I think in late 61, which was aborted. So why was it aborted? I mean, it was Hassan Kait and these people who were military officers in the north. Why didn't they succeed? I think they didn't succeed because the majority of the people, even in Somaliland or in northern Somalia, were not willing to give up the idea of unification. So they were criticizing the way how power was divided, and they were probably criticizing other things, but I think nobody in those days seriously doubted the idea or questioned the idea of Somali Wane.
Why is there a sort of animosity between Somaliland and Puntland in terms of where the border lies, and who defines this border, by the way?
Yeah, I think in my perspective, this dispute between Somaliland and Puntland is not over territory. It's about political vision. So it's also not about resources or something. I mean, these things come up more recently, but the dispute between Somaliland and Puntland, in my reading, is essentially about the question of what is the future of Somalia. Is there kind of a divided solution, like Somaliland as an independent country and the rest of Somalia as an independent country, or is it like at least the reconstruction of what has been Somalia between 1960 and 1991? So I think that's the core of this dispute, and that's also why this dispute is so complicated, I would say, because if it would be just about where the line is going, which territory is included in Somaliland, which territory is included in Puntland, then you could eventually probably find a solution, I think. Then if it's just if it would be just a readjustment of the borderline, so to say, then this can be negotiated. It has been negotiated in Sudan, South Sudan, and North Sudan. It has been negotiated in other places, Eritrea and Ethiopia, but I think the problem with Somaliland and Puntland is that Puntland sees itself, and that's also actually in the Puntland constitution, it sees itself as a representative of the Somali Republic. So in the absence of a strong Somali government in Mogadishu, Puntland, and that already was the idea in 1998 when Puntland was established, Puntland is kind of guarding the rights of Somalia. And in this sense, it could not let go Somaliland with its secession, right? And Somaliland is kind of trying, and that's, in my perspective, that's really kind of a very interesting twist in modern history, that Somaliland, as we also said before, Somaliland was actually the area where Somali nationalism or Somali Wane, the idea of Somali Wane, was very strong in the 1950s and also 1960s. And it is now, or it became then in the 1990s, the area where the idea of Somali Wane was buried. And if you see the Somaliland flag, you have the black star in the flag. So the black star, as you know, is actually the sign of the death of the Somali Wane idea. So it has been the cradle of Somali nationalism, and now also it has been basically the burial ground of Somali nationalism in a way, if you like. So anyway, so I think this dispute is eventually over the idea of what Somalia should look like in the future.
Okay, interesting. Sool Sanaag, or what is known as Khartoum State, has been caught in the middle in terms of what's going on in Somaliland, political aspiration in terms of its secession, and Puntland's political ambition in terms of being a guardian of what is Somali Federal Government. And Khartoum State, who is actually not seceding, but who is also not a strong key player as Puntland, is somewhat in the middle of this sort of infringements. So who really has the final say, practically, because the Somali Federal Government is not there to assist them in terms of their own identity as a federal state.
Here I would like to say a few more words. Let me start with the history of this Khartoum state, so to say. I mean, what led actually to the formation of Khartoum, because I think this has been very badly understood, probably also among many other Somalis, but also among other area specialists. So you have this long-standing dispute between Somaliland and Puntland over this area. So why is there this dispute? Because Somaliland claims the borders of the British Protectorate, and Puntland claims to be the representative of all the Harti in the region. So, and the Dulbahante and Warsangili living in the regions Sanaag and Sool, and also around Buhotle, they basically fulfill both requirements. Though their territory is within the borders of the former British Protectorate, but genealogically speaking, they belong to the Harti descent group. And those guys, according to my experiences in the area, they deliberately did not decide to whom to belong. So like from a very pragmatic point of view, you could go to Las Anod, you could go to Buhotle, you could go to Teleh, you could go to Baran and ask people, so what do you want? Do you want Somaliland or do you want to be Puntland? So just decide and then take a side in order to finish these complications. And what people told me actually in the region is that they deliberately didn't decide because they want to keep both of them together. They want to be in the middle. Of course, some people would say, okay, they're gaining something from Hargeisa and they're gaining something from Garowe. And as you know, there are some Warsangili and Dulbahante politicians in Somaliland, and there are Warsangili and Dulbahante positions in Puntland. So, but I think it's not only for economic gain, it's not only for the gain of political power, because things in Hargeisa are very often decided by other people, not by Warsangili and not by Dulbahante, and things in Garowe are also decided by other people. We all know what I mean. But I think many people in these regions told me that de facto they want to make sure that neither Somaliland nor Puntland is going astray. So they want to keep Somalia together.
Yeah.
So this led to a situation where there was nobody really wanted to invest in this area. Neither Hargeisa trusted these people, nor Garowe really trusted these people. And even the diaspora, Dulbahante diaspora, Warsangili diaspora, they didn't invest much in these places because they always thought it's an unstable area. We never know where it's going, though they put their money somewhere else and not in this area. And this was the situation in the early 2000s when I came to this region. So it was pretty marginalized areas with no development actually, but also no military conflict yet. Though the people who were running the business in Sool and Sanaag and the area around Buhotle were traditional authorities. Garado, Isimada, they were Isimada. So it was a very interesting area of no governance, I would say. So things have changed in 2003, 2004, when Somaliland and Puntland were actually trying to enforce their claims to the area, and they sent military troops to the area. Then first Puntland occupied Las Anod for a short period of time, and Somaliland occupied Las Anod, which is the capital of Sool region, and most of this conflict then has been developing in the Dulbahante areas. The Warsangili area stayed a little bit out of this complication.
So when you say occupied, does that mean there was an armed struggle that took place where the two parties came together and fought?
when Puntland actually was taking over Las Anod, it was in December 2003, there was no real armed struggle. There was no resistance. The Puntland forces came to town. I was in Las Anod at the time. The Puntland forces came to town, and there was no Somaliland presence anyway. So they just occupied the place, and the local population was in agreement. Some people were not really happy because they were expecting a counter-reaction by Somaliland, and they were actually quite right. But most people, like genealogically speaking, they said, Wawalalo. So, Somaliland reacted, of course, and they sent their troops in January, February 2004 to an area called Ari Adeye. It's a small village, 30 kilometers or 40 kilometers west of Las Anod. And then this conflict boiled up until there was a military clash in October. It must have been in October 2004, just after Abdullahi Yusuf had been elected president of the Transitional Federal Government in Kenya. And you know, he was a hardliner. Yeah. So I think he was instigating this clash to some degree as far as he could. Probably, I'm not 100% sure of it. But anyway, this clash happened shortly after he had been elected president of Somalia. And from then on, the situation remained like a military confrontation for several years. And Puntland kept control over parts of Sool, including Las Anod, and parts of Sanaag, including some of the Singili territories, and Somaliland controlled the rest. However, I think Puntland didn't really do a very good job in controlling and administrating the area, also developing the area. There was no real development happening in this time. And then there was a complicated internal crisis in Puntland in 2006-2007 when Ade Musa was president of Puntland, and I think he didn't really pay much attention to this conflict. He was much more concentrated on developing the core area of Puntland, the Machitin territories, and particularly his area around Bosaso, and he was interested in resource extraction and resource exploitation in the territory around Bosaso. He developed those things, and he didn't really pay much attention to this conflict zone. And at one point, he fell out with his interior minister, who was called Ahmed Abdi Hashi, I think. He was a Dulbahante, a very senior Dulbahante politician. And then this led to all kinds of complications. Eventually, the former interior minister of Puntland changed sides. He switched to Somaliland again. And he led the troops of Somaliland, together with a couple of other colleagues, into the area. And they took over Las Anod. But there was no real battle over Las Anod. The Puntland troops just retreated. So they retreated to a place called Tukarak, which is east of Las Anod, and on the way to Garowe. And the Somaliland troops took over the control over the city. However, then in November 2007, you had fighting in Las Anod going on between Dulbahante militias and some militias which were against the Somaliland forces and some militias which were in favor of the Somaliland forces. So why do I tell you all this long-winded story? Because this, in fall 2007, in October, November 2007, this was a decisive moment which gave rise to the establishment of SSC, Sool Sanaag and Ain, which then turned into Khartoum State. Why? Because the local population, they never wanted to be militarily controlled by Somaliland forces. They accepted political interferences, they accepted this political game between Hargeisa and Garowe, and they even accepted the Puntland control, because for genealogical reasons, I would say, but they never accepted to be militarily occupied by forces coming from Bro. And this, of course, has to do with the animosities going back to the 1980s, to the period of Siad Barre, and when most Dulbahante, one has to say, supported the previous government, and most Isaac supported the Somali National Movement, which eventually took control of the Northwest. And in this time, like 2007, 2008, many people in Sool region and around Buhodle, they were expecting that Ade Musa would finally move his troops to challenge Somaliland and to retake Las Anod, which he never did, for various reasons. Part of it was, I just mentioned, he was concentrated on economic developments in Puntland. And when people in the area realized that they basically are left alone and there's no hearty solidarity then they took the decision to actually establish their own militia. And there was traditional authorities involved, the Isimada were involved, diaspora actors were involved. They had a conference in London, they had a conference in Nairobi, and eventually in 2009, in fall 2009, they established what is called Sool Sanaag and Administration, SSC, led by a guy called Saliban Hagle from Buhotle. And this was like a militia. It was a militia group which had the aim to free Las Anod and all these territories, all the area around Buhotle from Somaliland occupation, as they called it. Of course, Hargeisa never called it Somaliland occupation because for them it was always anyway their territory. But from a local perspective, it was an occupation. The SSC didn't really succeed. It didn't go anywhere. It ended up in a couple of skirmishes with Somaliland national forces in the area around Buhotle, in the area around Las Anod, but it never did any kind of, it never achieved any kind of military victory. And it also had internal complications. There was internal rivalries. So by 2010, the SSC was defunct. However, the sentiment was still alive. The sentiment that we are occupied and we are not free and our land is even taken away. The sentiment was alive. I was in the region in those days. I was really shocked how hate speech started again. Like the clan cleansing topic came up in these times in the area. If it's correct or not, it's another matter. But people felt really like under pressure, and people were really excited about these issues. And this was in the time when I think there was a Khartoum conference in London, and then later on there was a Khartoum conference in Teleh in the region, when they decided, okay, the SSC has died, but now we have to follow up. And though we establish a new administration which is better organized. SSC was not really well organized, but Khartoum was then well organized. There was a lot of consultations happening in 2011 in the territory, where traditional authorities, intellectuals, diaspora people, they all visited the area. They talked to so many people in the villages. They said, what do you want? And I think the results of what most people want was to set up their own administration, which takes care of peace, which takes care of development, which establishes contacts to Mogadishu, and probably also attracts international support. And this was the birth of Khartoum. So you can see Khartoum came about because of the military conflict between Somaliland and Puntland, because of the military occupation of Las Anod from the Hargeisa side, and because of the neglect of the Puntland leadership of what we can call Hartinimo. So I have to emphasize, because some people say Khartoum is just a diaspora creation, which in my perspective is absolutely wrong. Khartoum is the result of a strong sentiment among the local population to change their fate, to get development, to get peace to their area, and to be their own masters, basically, between Somaliland and Puntland. And when there was this federal agenda adopted for Somalia, they thought, okay, why don't we become a federal state? I think, and in 2011 they were relatively successful after Khartoum had been established, or 2012, I think 2012 in January they had been established. So for the first few months, Khartoum entered into a couple of military conflicts with Somaliland, but they also really organized themselves relatively well within. They had a real administration with a leadership, with some kind of councils. They tried to establish a good contact to Mogadishu, and so on and so forth. However, it also ran into a lot of difficulties recently, and Khartoum at the moment, as we speak in early 2014, is again a very weak actor. Nevertheless, I think the idea still could be that it's part of Somalia, it's part of a federal Somalia. If it's rejoining Puntland, if there's some negotiations ongoing, or if it's kind of standing for its own, we don't know yet. But the political decisions are taken actually, I would say, by local actors, by the traditional authorities in the area, and by some diaspora supporters.
Okay.
Mohammed?
What's in it?